tonight's speaker. Many of you have heard of Jane Baxter. She began at Boston University but received her PhD from the University of Michigan, where she worked on the archaeology of childhood in the 19th century. In the years since then, her main focus has continued to be historic archaeology of the United States. She was instrumental in helping to create the National Monument at Pullman. Since the year 2000, Dr. Baxter has served at DePaul University, where her reputation as an excellent researcher, scholar, and teacher has led her not only to survive at DePaul, which is difficult enough as it is, but to become an associate professor in anthropology and now chair of the department. You deserve the applause. Just remember what Edward Sapir said about being chair. Anybody who has no experience with it thinks it must be something important, but everybody who's had experience with it knows that you actually have no power.
He's been chair.
And that's why you should applaud, right? She's willing to take this on. She's also served on the board of directors of the Society for American Archaeology. And if all that isn't enough, she's here tonight to talk about the above-ground burials at some of Chicago's classic cemeteries. Please welcome Jane Baxter.
Thank you so much, everybody. I've given this talk once before, so once I agreed with Barbara that this was going to be our talk, I gave it at an Archaeology and Ale event a few months ago, which, if any of you know, the AIA in Chicago has every other month they have a private room at a bar. You can have food and drink and listen to a talk. And I gave this talk at Hop Leaf, which is the regular spot, and the bartender, who's been the same bartender for 2 years, said this is the only talk that didn't make her want to leave early and go home and fall asleep. Wow. So this is a highly endorsed presentation. I'm going to talk about cemeteries as someone who has always had a lifelong interest in cemeteries. I teach a course on Chicago's historic cemeteries at DePaul. And I have done some work, publications and work, particularly on children and children's memorials. I'll talk about it a little bit at the end, in Chicago cemeteries. But this is now going to be kind of the seed of a project. I'm going to do a national project looking at cemeteries across the United States and American families through how they chose to commemorate themselves in cemeteries. So this is going to be kind of my last big hurrah project. This is the seed of that. So what I'd like to do tonight, I'll kind of go through, it has 4 parts. I'm not going to introduce them, I'm just going to go through them. Why waste the time doing that? But I do want to make sure that I say thank you to people who need thanks. Barbara McDonough made that really attractive flyer, which I'm sure enticed many of you here, if the topic itself did not. And also to my partner Jim, who's over here, he's recording. My dad is in ICU. Hi, Daddy. And so he wanted to see my talk. So he's recording this for my dad, but he also took a lot of the photos that you're going to see tonight, so I have to give him credit. Everything else I've tried to say where I stole it from. So, all right. This is one of the worst maps I could ever imagine, and here I am starting a presentation with it. It's an interactive map that I did not make, but what it really does really nicely is show you how many cemeteries there are in Cook County. There are over 200, close to 250 cemeteries in Cook County, of varying sizes, shapes, configurations, denominations, and some of them are quite famous. I've put some up here that are famous mostly because they're famous for being allegedly haunted. Right? Bachelor's Grove Cemetery is considered one of the most haunted sites in America. We have Graceland Cemetery and the grave of Inez Clark, who I guess on whims breaks out of her little glass case and dances around the cemetery. Oh my goodness, she dropped her coffee. The mic came off. Inez must be upset that I'm sort of complaining her as a whimsical creature. And then, of course, Resurrection Cemetery with Resurrection Mary, our own hitchhike ghost. I'm not going to talk about ghosts today, but it's often how cemeteries come into the public consciousness. But I also wanted to point out that if any of you drive any distance in Cook County on any given day, you're probably going by one cemetery or another, and you're probably not always giving them an awful lot of thought. Right? But what I want to do tonight is put them in kind of a context and show you how I, as an archaeologist, look at them and use them and think about them as spaces where we can learn about people in the past. So what I'd like to do is give you all a overview of where our cemeteries come from. Often we accept things on the landscape like suburbs and cemeteries and parks as sort of just things that always have been. But they actually have really specific historical origins, and that is very much the case with cemeteries. So I want to give you a bit of how the cemeteries we see all the time in Cook County came to be as a particular American institution. And we can go all the way back to some very early Christian traditions in Europe. So the top picture here is St. Peter's tomb in the Vatican, right? A very early Christian tradition. And then some of the kings and queens buried in Westminster Abbey. The earliest Christian traditions, particularly for those of wealth and influence, emphasized being buried inside churches. Churches were the house of God. Being interred inside God's house ensured a certain kind of perpetual relationship with the God in the great beyond, but it isn't something that really existed in this way prior to Christian traditions. This spreads to larger segments of the population. So if any of you travel, these are just pictures from our travels, and if you were a parishioner who could afford a burial, you didn't have to be a king or a queen or a saint or anybody else. You could get buried inside the church, in crypts. So up here we have a crypt. You can see how they're marked in the churches. You can see, here's letting you know that somebody's below you inside the church. This is the plaque for Jonathan Swift, who was the deacon of the cathedral in Dublin, and underneath, it tells you, underneath here are his mortal remains. Most crypts have been cleared out because it is not a preferred burial method. It's a fundamentally flawed method. Can anybody think of why? Well, it smells terrible. Every time I go into churches, I think that must have been awful back in the day, right? No embalming, you're sitting in church sometimes all day, right? Early church services were all day Sunday, and everybody was under the floorboards letting you know they were there. You also have a finite space. You've built a building, and as you have having people dying and dying, you're running out of room, right? So you've got a space problem and a smell problem and probably health and sanitation problems too. So now when you go to Europe, you can go, this is me at the top in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral. There's Jim eating dinner in the crypt at St. Martin's in the Field. Some of the best cheap food in Europe is if you're willing to go eat it in a crypt, right? And they're lovely. They're finished with the old tombstones and monuments, and the food's often quite lovely. And you get to sort of hang out a little bit in these spaces that have since been cleared out. So how did they solve these problems, and where did everybody go when they were removed from the crypt? Well, you built God a lawn, essentially, right? You extend the boundaries of consecrated space to include a churchyard. So you find ways of creating outdoor space and increasing the amount of space that you have available. Some of these are in the form of cloisters where you can bury people. Others are in churchyards, right? Graveyards and burying grounds are somewhat different than what we see here in the US as cemeteries. They actually didn't originally have pathways like these do now. And each headstone was generally for an individual person. So it was simply, you didn't buy a plot, you didn't plan your cemetery, your funeral the way that we do now. When you passed away, you were put in the next available space in the graveyard. There wasn't a big emphasis on visitation, so there weren't pathways and walkways so you could go commune with your loved ones later. That's just where people were. And the idea was you were still close to God's house, you were still on God's land, and so you had this proximity. And this is what's brought originally to the United States, right? This is the predominant way that early either burying grounds, like the one on the right from Boston, that doesn't have a specific church attached, or church graveyards, like this one from Charleston. They mimic these patterns from Europe. They're one of the things that are imported. The small inset in the middle is a reconstructed church at Jamestown, of course, one of the earliest settlements. But the plaques are original. And they have that same, here lies the body, underneath the floor, those kind of things. So you can see all these things being imported directly from Europe into the United States. But I'll tell you what, history doesn't repeat, but sometimes it rhymes. As places got more urbanized, got more crowded, guess what happens? You run out of space in your burying ground, and you've got a whole city built up around it now, right? And this becomes particularly acute in the 19th century when we become an urbanizing industrial nation. So, what happens? Well, these cemeteries become really problems in urban spaces. They're not terribly hygienic. They're running out of space. There are historical reports in some of these cemeteries of bodies being stacked 7 and 8 deep, some just a foot under the ground, and then becoming disinterred by wildlife and other interested parties. It's really like, it's rough and tumble. It wasn't just the West that was wild people, right? Like, this is New England. I'm from New England. This is what our cemeteries are like. So what do? We do the same thing again. How can we expand the space we've allotted to house the dead? And in this case, it's also, how can we separate them from us? In the 19th century, there's a real emphasis on hygiene. There's a real emphasis on sanitation, keeping things clean. And this first happens in Massachusetts. And I don't think it's an accident that it happens in the same state where our Industrial Revolution starts, where you have this real influx into large cities. So this is Boston, my home city. Oops, I just shut that off. That's not what I wanted to do, what I'm trying to find. So if I have a pointer, but I don't see where I do offhand. So this is Boston, downtown Boston. You cross the river, here's Charlestown, Bunker Hill's over here, Cambridge. And this is Mount Auburn Cemetery, founded in 1831. It's considered the first rural garden cemetery in the United States. And you can see how far it is from downtown Boston, right? It was in the middle of the countryside at the time. I went to college in Boston, as Will mentioned, and I can tell you, it's a gorgeous space. It's up on a hill. There's spectacular views back down to the city. And when I was in college, if you were dating a guy and he wanted to get serious, he took you for a walk up on Mount Auburn. You weren't allowed to keep dating other people if you got like the picnic treatment. It was like the height of romance for a city college date because it was free and it felt romantic. But anyway, so this is sort of the solution, is to move these cemeteries well outside of city centers and also to create and change the type of cultural institution that they are. So for the first time, cemeteries become pre-planned spaces. Here's a map of Mount Auburn. Mount Auburn, like all such cemeteries, were corporate ventures. So they're not bought in by a congregation or by a church. It's a group of business people who buy up the land and sell plots to people. All of these cemeteries, the ones in Chicago, which I'll get to included, had downtown offices. So you could go buy your plots and make your arrangements. And so for the first time, you could make decisions about what was going to happen after you died. They also have some really distinct features. All rural garden cemeteries, and this appears over and over and over again across the United States, have a wall around them, a symbolic space between the dead and the living, and one entrance. If there's a second entrance, like at Rose Hill, if any of you have been there, it's because of a later expansion. The original 19th century design would have given you one point of entry so that you were forced to enter in and see the landscape from the point of view of the landscape designer. They were supposed to be like parks. And you can see they have winding roads, they have lakes, they have pre-planned sort of, like I said, landscaping with different types of trees, and the monuments are fit into this overarching design. Cemeteries become, very much because you can pre-plan, a way of reinforcing class and community that existed in living society. If you had a lot of money, you could build a much bigger monument because you weren't taking up somebody else's space, you had paid for the land. If you wanted, you could build up on a hill and look down on all the little people, just like you probably liked doing when you were alive. And you could also pick your neighbors. Do you want to be with people from your own community, whether that's an ethnic community, not a Catholic or a Jewish community, although they do have add-ons, but a Protestant community of which you're a part? You know, you could make these kinds of choices. And it becomes I like to think of it as the last neighborhood. You pick who you live with, and this is who you're going to live with forever. And the same kind of thought that people were giving to where to buy a house is where they thought about where they were going to build their family plot for perpetuity. This is also part of a big movement that happens in the 19th century. Rural garden cemeteries are one part of something that starts to happen around the culture of death and dying in America in the middle of the 19th century. It's often called the beautification of death movement, and it is a very death positive way of seeing things. Some scholars will say, like, now sex is in and death is taboo. In the 19th century, death was in and sex was taboo. Like we flip-flopped, right? Sort of our sensibilities. And this led to a whole lot of cultural practices around death and dying that we don't really connect to as much anymore. There were memento mori photographs. So in this picture on the left, the girl in the middle is 12, 13 years old. She's deceased, and she's being posed as she's still alive with her parents. And that's gonna hang in their living room. Very common form of photography. Sometimes it's because photography was expensive. You had no photo. You hadn't gone, especially with younger children, you hadn't gone and had a photograph taken, and you want some record of the life. They were here, they were part of our family. So this was a very common form, and like they really were displayed with prominence in people's homes. You had, if you think of Queen Victoria, for who the age in England is named for, an elaborate culture of mourning and grief that included dress and behavior and social expectations, but it also transfers into the cemetery. These monuments that are particularly beautiful, that represent emotion in very literal ways, the very sad figure, the weeping angels, the idea that we can connect to these emotions and express them in material form. But it's also a time when death is celebrated but denied. So it's when you start to see euphemistic expressions on headstones. It's not "here lies the mortal remains," it's "asleep with Jesus," resting in peace. The death hasn't really happened, right? It's a different form. A lot of historians, and I would agree, argue that a lot of this has to do with the fact that the Industrial Revolution is so disruptive to American families. People are having to move, they're giving up cottage industries, family farms, they're moving into cities, they're selling their labor. The only time they see each other is at meals. But where's the one place you can be sure you all come back together again? At the end of it all, right? Your family can still be together, and it represents sort of a longing for an age when the family was really the cornerstone of American life. Whether that nostalgia was justified or not, but the disruption is very real. The other thing that then happens, if you're sort of trying to perpetuate ideas of beauty and family and mourning cultures, is that cemeteries were designed to be visited. I have students who quite regularly have never been to a cemetery. We were talking about this at dinner. 20-year-olds have all 4 grandparents. They've never been to a funeral. They've never gone to a cemetery. They're just not spaces they've encountered. And they always say, well, I don't know if we should be here. And I say, why do you think people put the stones up? If they wanted you to forget about them, I can think of a bargain basement way to take care of that. It's not a several $100,000 display of rock, right, with carvings. So the idea was, excuse me, you'd go visit. And there were etiquette books on how to dress, how to speak, what to wear, when to go, who to go with. This mourning culture, if you were traveling to a city, you would stop at the downtown office. So this is the visitor's guide to Mount Auburn Cemetery. And you would buy it, and as part of being a cultured visitor to a city, you wouldn't just go to the great museums, you'd go see their flagship cemetery. There are guides to historic 19th century guides and special collections to all of Chicago's major cemeteries that people would have picked up and taken with them and gone on a tour. So, and when you were there, you would have admired the monuments. You could have, in later days, that's in New York City, had lunch. And there was a real lack of separation, despite that symbolic separation of a wall. There was a real engagement with these spaces, right? And that's sort of how they were designed to be used. Our culture has changed an awful lot around death. Death is not a subject that we talk about a lot. It's not something that is celebrated, and we have these, I think they look like golf courses, sort of, really not challenging golf courses. You're not supposed to have a headstone. Being able to mow the cemetery is more important than the nature of the commemoration to your loved ones. And we don't have the same kind of real elaborate expressive stones. We do have like those carvings that are kind of in, that you can laser cut your hobbies or your things, but it isn't, you don't buy a stone that's 20 times the size of your neighbor and is a figural representation of something. So this is something that's become somewhat lost over time. And our cemeteries have changed as a result. There we go. All right, so let's start talking about Chicago, because Chicago is very much a part of this movement. This is a map of Chicago, a schematic map in 1835 that was done by a geographer, William Patterson, who did one of the first studies of Chicago cemeteries. And I've put a bright red dot for you at the 0 in the Chicago grid at State and Madison, so you can see where that is. And what you can see in 1835 is a whole bunch of little cemeteries. There are village cemeteries, there are town cemeteries, there's a cholera cemetery, there's a churchyard with a cemetery, and there's the beginnings of the city cemetery. So in 1831, Boston housed Mount Auburn. Chicago is still a tiny little village, relatively speaking, and is still burying inside the town limits. This starts to become a problem, and the city cemetery is created to consolidate all of those little cemeteries. The city cemetery operates from the 1830s, right about the time Patterson showed this, until about 1870 is when it closed. And they consolidated all of the burials in this one area along Lake Michigan. But in 1859, so not that much longer, Chicago is getting bigger and bigger, it's growing, it's becoming a big metropolis, it's having the crowding problems and the urbanization problems that East Coast cities have already experienced. And they say this is really unsanitary. Could have told you that. You put it next to your water supply. I don't know who was thinking that through. I wouldn't have put a cemetery next to where my drinking water came from, but I wasn't around to be asked, and they wouldn't have listened anyway. So they determined it would be a good idea to move the cemetery. The cemeteries had to go outside the city limits. The famous remnant is the Couch Mausoleum that is still along the Chicago lakefront. Nobody's quite sure why it wasn't removed. And these on the left, all you had to do if you had a relative was to write a little note saying, please rebury them. So even if the family was no longer Chicago, and there are collections of these, and they're fascinating. Do this, put my uncle here, take my grandparents here, please do this. And of course we also know that people who weren't buried with any ceremony in the first place, the impoverished, the people in the potter's field, in some of the sickness sort of cemetery mass graves, were never moved. So they still find human remains pretty regularly in development in Lincoln Park because it was not a complete job. If you didn't do this and then pay for the bill, they weren't gonna move you. So at the time, there were 3 big cemeteries that emerged to start taking in people from the city cemetery. The bottom is Oakwoods, our South Side Cemetery, my personal favorite in the city. Interestingly, has the earliest charter of all of these. So they all have a claim to why they're first, whatever. Do your thing. But Oakwoods is because they had the first charter. The business people who got together to form Oakwoods got a charter in 1853. And what I find particularly interesting about it is their charter had a special law passed around it saying if you're buried here, you will never, ever, ever be moved. It's the law. And it suggests to me that people in Chicago relatively early in the city's history are sick of this like churning the graveyards around. And the idea of having a perpetual charter where Oakwoods can never be moved under any circumstances was a huge marketing point that they were going for. It's telling, I think. We also have Graceland on the upper left, and then Rose Hill on the right. And you can, if you probably can't see, I can't see, but it gives it its office in downtown Chicago. And so these were all quite a bit outside the city. Here's that expansion. And if you take the little blue box as Chicago at the time, in the 1860s, look at how far outside the city. This is miles and miles and miles outside the city that these cemeteries are being built. I think it was unfathomable to these people that this would become subsumed within the city limits of Chicago as it is today. All of these are on major train lines. So if I take the IC, which also goes to Homewood, and if you ever take it and you're going past 67th Street, I would encourage you to take a look to the left. You'll see Oakwoods coming up on the right, and there is a ramp with train tracks that go down to ground level. It's never used, and it was to make sure that bodies and visitors could get to this, or mourners particularly, could get to the cemetery. If you go to Rose Hill, in the cemetery gates, against the train tracks, is an elevator in one of the pillars to take caskets off the train and bring them down to ground level so that you could have your burial service in the cemetery. So these are all serving the city, but they are really outside the city boundaries. The other thing that these cemeteries are supposed to do for this urban population that's struggling with industrialism is give them natural places that are safe to wander. Of course, they're not natural at all. They've been completely over-designed. But the idea is that you could go to these spaces, you could still sort of maintain an air of gentility, you could commune with God, you could commune with nature, you could read the headstones and become educated in civic matters and in religious matters through this experience. Okay, so from there, let's talk a little bit about cemeteries as archaeological sites. Lots of people go to cemeteries for lots of different reasons, right? Genealogists, historians, demographers, just nosy people like me. Sometimes you want to go paw around. But I look at these sites very much as something I can study using all of the methods that I've used to study things archaeologically. So I really do see myself, while I am not doing any excavation, as someone who's approaching these sites first and foremost on the material culture, the actual material remains of the spaces. So why I find cemeteries so interesting personally is, first of all, you have a population. You have this neighborhood, all of these neighborhoods, all of these social demographics playing out in a single space, right? And so what you can see is, if you go through and you start recording stones, is you can see the range of variation. What is it that's considered an acceptable way to commemorate somebody at a particular time and place? But you can also see individual choices that people are making. So you can look at how different factors about a person, gender, age, ethnicity, wealth, whatever it is affecting the choices they make in this sort of conversation that everybody's having in this cemetery that people are going to visit. The other thing is, cemeteries tell us a lot about culture in ways other types of sites don't, right? We commemorate things in a very different way than we live our daily lives. So it's an alternative source. This image is really interesting. This is from a lady's handbook, one of those domestic handbooks that a woman would be given when she got married in the 19th century on how to run her household, that told you everything you need to know. And this is telling you the different costs of different types of funerals. So why you might choose headstone A over headstone B, and how many carriages you could have, and how many mourners you should have, and what kind of hot dishes you should have after the funeral. It's all in the guidebook for you, so that you can actually pick the kind of sort of social display you want to make in a very formulaic kind of way. These are fascinating books for so many reasons, but this I find particularly interesting. That, like, you know, there are recipes for jam and how to make a diaper right for your kid and which headstone to pick. They're kind of comprehensive. One of the things that I really enjoy about headstones is, all archaeologists do, I think, is they're relatively fixed in space. I've just talked about cemeteries moving, but they don't move beyond Chicago, right? The Chicago burials aren't going to San Francisco, and the Boston burials aren't coming out here. It's rare. It's common now because families are spread out, but historically that's not true. You're buried near where you died. So you have something that's fixed in space, and you also have dates. It's super convenient, right? Most archaeological sites, you have a handful of things you can date. In cemeteries, it's the exception when you have something you're looking at that you can't date. So you can really see change over time and space really clearly. You can also use, just like archaeologists do with all kinds of materials, an analysis of raw materials. You can learn about the cost of different monuments, the cost of different shapes, the amount of lettering, and also the different sort of qualities of display, right? So if you go to a Chicago cemetery now, the earliest graves are almost always highly eroded and difficult to read, but they're in white marble. Because in the 19th century, that whole idea of hygienics was tied to white. You had white plates on your table because they were clean. The bride wore white down the aisle. That starts in the 19th century. Babies wear white because they're pure. And when you're buried, you want to sort of reflect your purity, the purity of the soul, the purity of the experience, with white marble, which didn't hold up for anything. So really, it's unfortunate. But later, you have different kinds of choices being made and different styles, and you can look at that and look at sort of how much it's costing to make these final statements on behalf of your family. You can also do mapping, which I do of cemeteries, to look at how people are using social position to sort of show off who they are in life or who they were in life by showing off where they are in death. Things like topography, things like being close to a roadway. If you're in the middle of a section, most people don't walk over there unless it's really necessary. If any of you, like, if it's cold or rainy, we drive around cemeteries, we don't even get out. So if you're in the middle, like, I'll look at you, right? Like, if I'm doing research, I get in there. But, you know, how visible are you going to be? How do you stand out compared to your neighbors? And how are we using landscape to send messages about how important we are? Again, a core archaeological concept. And then finally, these are all from Chicago cemeteries. People add all kinds of things that enhance our understanding of these material remains by telling us what they'd like us to think of them, right? In two different ways, artistic and also in words, the epitaphs and information they give. My favorite grave of children, since that's what I study, largely in Chicago cemeteries, that's little India Kephart, and she's in Oakwoods, and I just find her so precious. And she was 9, and her parents were clearly devastated that India died. But if you look at her gravestone, she's telling you a lot about the family. She's in a scallop shell, which tells you that she's lived her life as a Christian. It's a Christian life enveloped by a scallop shell. It's a highly important symbol. She's asleep. That's that beautification of death. She's not dead, she's resting. She's going to be reunited with her family. They can't wait to see her someday. And if you look, her arms are clasped. She probably can't see what she's clasping. She's holding a little doll, which is also symbolic of the intergenerational relationship of families that's so important. So little India got a really special grave, but she's also telling the world an awful lot about her family at the same time. And 19th century people, you can buy guidebooks to these now. It's really fascinating. It's a forgotten language, but it was in fact a language. People didn't need books to understand what kind of flower that is. Is it in bloom? Is it, you know, in the bud? Is it cut? Those are all things that people just understood the meanings of what people were trying to convey. So it's super important to have that aspect too. So I want to finish up by talking a little bit about the work that I've been doing using these archaeological principles in Chicago cemeteries. And I really think children are a fascinating lens into society, period. The way that a society chooses to treat its children, define its children, is a very interesting lens on which you can sort of see and understand them. So this probably looks familiar. These are my study sites. Basically what I did is I wanted to look at children who were not buried with their family, but children who died essentially probably before anybody else in their family. They were the first death in their family here in Chicago, so they weren't in one of these planned family plots. You have an unexpected death of a child, because nobody ever really expects it, even if mortality is high. You have hopes that that child's gonna make it, but you decide to go and put a headstone in for them. So those are who I was looking at. And children I defined as people less than 15, because that's what the vital records tell us. That's the age that mattered to people at the time. That's how they understood childhood. Laws change at age 15. You could get married at age 15. All kinds of things happen that made you not quite a child. I can tell you this was an incredible period of fitness in my life, because what I did is I drove around the cemetery and found the sections of the cemetery that clearly dated to the period I was studying, which was 1867 to 1906. And that corresponds with how vital records are divvied up. And I then walked up and down every single row looking for little kids. It was tiring. Cemeteries are really lumpy. Like there is no flat ground once you're off the path. But the other thing I can tell you, so I recorded data from every single headstone I could find, and I photographed it. I couldn't include ones that didn't have dates, even if I knew it was from my period of study. And often it was because of poor preservation, not because it wasn't there originally. I can also tell you that this was a project I had a book come out today, an edited volume, and in it I talked about the emotional toll of studying dead children. It was really, really a difficult project in the long run to participate in other people's grieving. That's what I was doing day in, day out, was looking at people who were commemorating this really incredible loss to their family. And I would be, it doesn't make me sound like much of a scientist, but I think it makes me sound like a good person to say, if you're looking at this, it really does become affecting over time. So that's what I did for my project. And I'm going to just give you a few highlights. But one of the things that I think is really interesting is who gets commemorated. So I'm going to give you a quick snapshot of this, that you're not really going to be able to see all of the facts and figures, I understand. But here's what I want to show you, is if you look at this chart, this is a mortality population, and this is per 10,000 people. And just to give you a sense, in 1850, across the United States, an infant, so somebody less than a year old, had a 1 in 4 chance of dying. So 256 or so out of every 1,000 babies died. Pretty extraordinary. And the rate is also not that much better if you're 5 years old, right? So it's a high death rate. So for the first decade I was studying, 2,800 infants died in the city of Chicago, a relatively small place, and about 1,600 children under 5. That's a high mortality rate in a not a very big population. So what I did is I still went and I looked, and there were less than a dozen cemeteries at the time, and I looked at 3 of them, right? So I only found 200 graves under the age of 15 from that decade in 3 cemeteries. So let's add a few factors. Okay, so I couldn't read all of the graves. Let's add some in, right? And I didn't look at every single grave in every single section of the cemetery. Maybe there were a few tucked in. Even if we doubled the number and then some and said 500, that is a tiny percentage of children from a much wider age span, right? 15 for the headstones, 5 and under for the deaths, that are being commemorated at all. So it is incredibly rare for a child in these early periods to actually, the family to spend the time and the money to purchase a headstone. They're being commemorated, though, in ways that are incredibly sweet. The top 2 are very early examples. These are from the bottom or the later end of my study period. The sort of the key design, the one that you see over and over, is one that looks like this. And on the top in raised letters is a sweet little nickname. It's never the full name. The full name appears on the front. It's a nickname, which is telling you how much that child meant to somebody, right? It's intimacy. It's part of a family. It's that they were a person. Sometimes that's replaced by a lamb. There are lots of headless lambs. There are no lambs for adults in any cemetery I have ever visited. It is a child-only symbol. Symbolizes their eternal innocence. These become more common later. This is a gray marble sort of little slab that has much less information, and then sort of towards the end you get less and less. It's interesting. You can see that trailing off of interest in death, right? That's starting to happen with children. But the earliest graves are the ones that have all this elaboration. So what I decided to do, because it's hard when you're looking at big populations to do something that's kind of quick, is I created sort of a coding system for what people were writing about their children on headstones. And so I chose a few things. Is there a religious message of some kind? Be asleep in Jesus, a Bible verse referring to children, not uncommon. I had something about rest or sleep, that euphemism that's supposed to evoke the eternal family. I used a possessive. And this may seem like no small thing, but there is a huge difference when you see a headstone that says, "Our darling Walter," or one that just says Walter. Saying a possessive says that he's ours, right? He's part of us. So I recorded that as a really important variable. Whether or not they had a nickname, whether or not their family role was specified, are they a daughter, are they a son, of whom? And also, is there a lament? Are they saying how sad they are and what they've written? And this is just Oakwoods and Rosehill for ease of comparison. But what you can see is there's a big difference. Actually, if you look at like how people were buried in the south side of the city and how they were buried in the north, you can actually see a real difference. You can see a lot more personal importance in these South Side communities where these children are being really specified as individuals, much more so than in the Northern Cemetery of Rose Hill. So, why do I think that matters? Well, I think it has everything to do with Chicago's population at the time and the importance of children. Okay, so I think there's a couple of things here. If we go back, here we'll go back. This is actually from Indianapolis, from Crown Hill, but you can see this is a whole family's children, and each one has a matching little headstone. So sad. So many children, or where they've gone back and put their own headstones on either side of the children. So on the one hand, I think that it's really clear, as historians have talked about, how important family is, and it's really clear how important children are to the construction of family, much like it is now. For someone who chose to never have children, you have no idea how many times in my life I was asked if I would ever start a family, and I'm like, yeah, we're right here. Like, there's two of us, right? But the idea that children make a family was incredibly important. So commemorating them was giving your family a certain kind of validity. But I think the other part of it comes from the fact that everybody who was in Chicago came to Chicago. Doesn't mean that you came from somewhere else overseas, but it certainly means you came from somewhere out east, right? And here you are. And of course, we have a large immigrant population. But why does it matter? Well, I think it matters for two reasons. Number one, if you're trying to establish your family in a new place, and you have a child, and that child dies, and you bury them in Chicago, you've literally put your blood in the soil, right? We belong here. Our family is here now. We are a Chicago family. We have a reason to be here. We have a reason to visit this cemetery. This is a place for us. The other thing, though, is I think as you are thinking about the 19th century and the typical immigrant story and the typical story of families under capitalism, you're always trying to better yourself, right? And you better yourself through your children. You provide them with things, you send them to school, you hope that they're going to do better than you did. This is for Willie Omohundro. He's 12. He's buried in Rose Hill. And the lament that is written across his gravestone is, "Oh, what hopes lie buried here." I mean, that tells you everything. We have invested, and look at the money they invested. That's a zinc. Those were not cheap. Zinc was not the cheap route. They've given him a beautiful burial as a 12-year-old, but they're also telling you, we had put a lot of eggs in this basket, right? Willie was going to carry the family forward in this new place, and look what we lost, right? So it's very telling, I think. So while most families couldn't necessarily afford to do it, when they did, I think they had really real reasons and were making some really serious statements about who they were in this growing city. So I'm going to end there. We covered a ton of ground. And since most of you have probably seen a cemetery before, there's probably things you'd like to comment or question on. So we'll give you a chance to do that.